Many see progress and environmental protection as competing priorities, where one must always be chosen over the other. At ELOS, we see things differently. We see a partnership, a balance between improving the quality of our lives and preserving the places we call home. Our services make it possible for projects to move forward while also ensuring that they comply with all laws and regulations, that sensitive wetlands are not damaged or destroyed, that endangered species and habitats are protected, and that invaluable cultural resources are preserved for future generations. This is where we live, where we play, where we raise our families. We strive for a brighter future, but remain committed to the lands we love. ELOS, where natural environments and human interests intersect.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Bud. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction for our company. Many of you probably know ELOS. We were founded in 2006, so just about 20 years ago. We are located in Hammond, Louisiana, and we do have an office in Thibodaux, Louisiana. And we play a pretty big role and have a pretty big footprint in the environmental consulting field in Louisiana and other states. We leverage our expertise primarily in the permitting, environmental side, and we do have a growing coastal footprint, and that's part of the reason I'm here today and what I really wanted to discuss during this presentation. So a little bit about me. I have over 20 years experience in coastal Louisiana, primarily working initially with the state CPRA, and then made the transition to the private sector. I've been at ELOS for just under 2 years. And as I started working on some of the projects that ELOS gets involved, I really got an insight into the permitting world, and both at the front end, but also on the construction side, and making sure that our clients adhere to all the requirements of their permit. It's been a bit of an eye-opening for me and a little bit of a journey. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity for me to share some of my lessons learned and some insights, and of course augmented with Brian Fortson's expertise, who's also on the line and who will chime in as we go through the presentation. And one of the things that really sort of prompted me today to say, hey, prompted this subject is looking at all the work that's coming down from my former former employer, CPRA, who have over $1.4 billion in construction expenditures, and also all the work that the parishes are doing and that the state's doing through the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. I thought it would be a good time to talk about the permits, but also on the construction side, making sure that people adhere to the terms of those permits. So with that, let's talk about permits in general. I'm not gonna go on in depth into all of these, but really they're essential to make sure that projects comply with federal, state, and local regulations deemed or aimed at protecting natural resources and public health. These permits are there really just to mitigate the negative impacts or any potential negative impacts of construction or development activities on air, land, water, and wildlife. So I think from the project onset, it's really important to understand the types of permits that are needed for a project to make sure that you avoid any potential fines, project delays, and potential legal issues. But also once once the project is acquired, understanding how you must adhere to the conditions of the permit will help, whether you're an engineering firm or a construction firm or even a consultant, make sure that you avoid any trouble with agencies or veering outside of the limits of your permit. So with that, let's talk a little bit about understanding permits in general. In Louisiana, we do have a regulatory framework that helps us, or that really is geared towards projects that happen in the coastal zone versus the non-coastal zone. And we'll see when we talk about work in the coastal zone, those get to be a little bit more, I think probably a little bit more tricky, and maybe that's just my bias as a coastal planner. Working in the coastal zone just raises a few more issues, a few more flags, a few more things that you have to be concerned about because of the sensitive nature of the habitats that we're working in. So what are some of the permits that are most relevant to construction projects? They range from coastal use permits, which are required for activities that may impact wetlands, waterways, or coastal resources. And also they're there to ensure compliance with the LDNR, the state coastal management plans. The section
Right.
10. Sorry,
and
Brian.
those are primarily relevant in the state's coastal zone, which is the extreme southern part of the state. Coastal use permits are restricted to coastal zone.
That's right. Thanks for chiming in. Also, Section 10404 permits, those are issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for construction or dredging in navigable water wetland areas. The Section 404 permits are required under the Clean Water Act for dredge and fill activities. You also have the 401 water quality certifications. Those are required for projects that require, I apologize for that. Here we go. Problem with using multiple screens.
Yeah, water quality certification is a certification that's attached to the 404 permit. It is part of the 404 process, and it's required for the Corps to be able to issue the 404. The reason we call it out separately here is that water quality certification may well have some conditions of its own that you need to adhere to with regard to site drainage and stuff like that. And so you have a Corps permit, that Corps permit will have a 401 water quality certification attached to it, and it may have some of its own site prep conditions.
Yep. On the other side, there's also the Endangered Species Act, Section 7 take permit. And those are necessary when projects impact protected species or their habitat. Again, something to really look for in coastal Louisiana and other sensitive habitats. And then finally, in Louisiana, we have the Scenic River Act. So there's a scenic river permits that's issued by the LDWF, and that's required for activities affecting scenic rivers, and it's there just to ensure minimal environmental impact on these protected waterways. So in terms of understanding your permit, whether you're an engineering firm doing project management on a construction project, or a contractor looking at potentially something that's advertised, and you're trying to better understand the job that's on hand and looking at the permit requirements, or you're working for a consulting firm that may be helping out with compliance on the permit. There's a lot of different site-specific conditions and requirements that come with the permits. And it's really important that I'll probably repeat this several times just to get to know your permit, get familiar with it, because it's gonna keep you out of trouble. And one of those things is the SWIP, and the SWIP is just a plan that puts forward erosion and sediment control, really just to protect water quality. And it requires implementation of best management practices such as silt fencing, sediment basins, vegetative buffers. Another one that we commonly see in coastal Louisiana is the cultural resources avoidance. And again, that's there to and requires an assessment for historical and archaeological sites to avoid impacting those sites and cultural artifacts. And that may involve also coordination with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Offices. On the drainage side, as we alluded to earlier, having proper drainage plans, ensuring proper site grading and water runoff management to prevent erosion and flooding. Those can also be required as part of municipal land use approvals.
And let me say
Yep.
this with regard to drainage plans. They may or may not come in to detailed discussion during a permit process. But when the permit comes out, particularly if you're in the coastal zone, you may have a condition in your permit that says whatever you do pursuant to the construction of this project, you cannot have an adverse drainage impact on an adjacent property. It may be something as sort of general as that. What that condition is telling you is that you need to manage the water on your site according to a drainage plan, because if you're not, you may have an adjacent impact. So you may not get a specific request for drainage plans, but in the conditions in your permit, it is likely that you will need to have one and be complying with it or managing it just to avoid the other permit condition of offsite impacts.
Okay, thanks for that. Permit figures, visual map showing project boundaries, what your impact areas might be, or maybe mitigation zones. Again, keep those in mind, review those carefully as you're evaluating the permit, whether you want to bid on a project or you're just you're enforcing the conditions of the permit. It's essential for regulatory compliance and also field implementation. And then as you're starting to work, implementing measures to minimize environmental impacts or providing offsets such as wetland restoration or habitat creation.
Yeah, so at this point in the presentation, I think it's also appropriate. We could have renamed this presentation "Read Your Permit," because a lot of the stuff we're talking about is kind of typical stuff that's found in permits, and a lot of the issues that come up in construction, I don't know, probably a significant percentage of them are resulting from a condition that was just missed in the permit. Permit was issued, condition was in there, went off and started construction, and so they just missed the condition and didn't read it. So probably somewhere in this slide, one of the first things that we should have said is read your permit. But all of these things typically will show up as conditions in a permit, and all these things that we're going to talk about, and there are particular ways to avoid some of them or whatever. But the biggest thing you can do as a contractor or as an engineer on a project, as soon as you get that permit, read it and read every condition and make sure there's nothing that's inconsistent with what your plan for construction is or whatever, because you can deal with that up front. If you've got conditions that you have a problem with, you can deal with that before you start. But if you get caught down the road implementing construction and you've missed a condition, for instance, some of the conditions you might see in a construction project in a sensitive area might say you have to conduct a pre and post construction assessment of the property with photographs. Once you've started construction, your window for getting the pre-construction photographs is done. Mm-hmm. And so if you didn't get the pre-construction photographs, you may end up after the project, for instance, re-arguing your mitigation amount because you can't verify what the pre-project condition is, and that could cause a real problem. And so, really what we're trying to express here is that all of these various permits that we're talking about will have a list of conditions on them, and some of those conditions will fall down to the contractor or the project engineer to make sure they're dealt with.
Yeah. And I think going back to your comment, Brian, about start and end dates, pay close attention to those. When you're supposed to start work, when the windows where you can work, potentially you're dealing with endangered species in the area, nesting habitat, nesting times, and your also your permit will have an expiration date. So again, that goes back to, carefully reading all the conditions in your permit. You also have a duty to notify if, as you start working, you realize that there are either protected species or historical artifacts found. You must immediately stop work and report that activity. Report those findings. And that's just a good way to keep yourself out of trouble if you encounter those things. Keeping in mind too that you do have a duty to notify the agencies if you do err and you do make a mistake or you don't meet one of the conditions. You're much better off notifying the agencies rather than wait. Permits are also transferable, just something that you'll see in one of the conditions, that they're often transferable, and you do have a duty to avoid adjacent property impacts. So obviously that's part of the work here, is making sure that you also, if you're doing work adjacent to a levee, whether it's a Mississippi River levee, you may have specific conditions related to river elevation. So if the river is high, you need to stop work, or you may need to put together mitigation measures in place. So all these things are spelled out in the permit, and I think one of the things to always remember is if you're in doubt, double check, engage with the agencies, and ask questions. There are also habitat avoidance and monitoring requirements, as Brian mentioned earlier. You may need to do some monitoring pre-construction. You may also need to do some monitoring during and post-construction, whether for species or for habitats.
Right. Go back to that previous slide, please, Kareem.
Yep.
Just run down a couple of these. And so stormwater pollution prevention plan. If you are constructing a site over 1 acre, you have to have this thing. And most contractors and engineers probably familiar with it. But it is not until your site gets a little larger that you actually have to file notices of intent and things like that. So you as a contractor may not necessarily have seen this stormwater pollution prevention plan. It may have been sort of buried in the water quality certification or whatever. But that stormwater pollution prevention plan is a mandatory part of your site development, and most of it probably needs to be implemented before you turn any dirt. And so even if you did not require a core permit or a coastal use permit, the standards for stormwater pollution prevention still exist. And so that SWIP needs to be completed and implemented for everything at least over 1 acre. And in some cases under 1 acre, you still need to have the SWIP, although it probably doesn't need to be as formally robust. But that stormwater pollution prevention plan is sort of independent from some of these other permits, in that it's mandatory whether you have to get core permits, coastal zone permits, or anything. And often you will find that in the absence of Corps of Engineers and coastal use permitting, that the parish in which you are working may ask for this too, right? And so that's a pretty standard document, and it needs to be implemented appropriately, or it can be a violation of the terms of your permit. Commencement and expiration dates. Commencement, not as important. You can send it to them when they start. If you don't, they'll ask you for it after a while. Expiration dates are very important. Expiration dates, you need to pay attention. You may have to re-up those if you're still in construction. They do not have to necessarily be perpetuated beyond your construction to cover the existence of the project, but they do need to be in place while you're in construction. So if your construction extends past an expiration date, you're going to have to get with somebody and push that expiration date back. Permits are transferable, usually with a signature. The duty of non-compliance, to notify of non-compliance or changes. As contractors, you have some ability to shift the job in the field. If you come to a part of your road surface where it's just not going to cut it, taking this angle, we need to kind of go with this angle here, or curbs have to be installed where they weren't previously planned, things like that. You have a certain amount of flexibility to be able to change things in the field and then notify them later. That's a really fine line, because if the change in the field increases your wetland footprint, you got a permit modification process you have to go through. So it's not just to notify of the changes, but it is at least that. So you have where this comes up in my permits frequently is, for instance, somebody is installing a wharf on the Mississippi River and they go to set a pile down and they can't because there's an old ship sunk where the pile is supposed to go, and they need to move the pile over 6 feet and put it in there. They can do that. They can move that pile. But if it is relocated 6 feet, particularly if it is near a levee, you got to go back and tell everybody, hey, we moved this pile 6 foot over. It's now here. And so it's a duty to notify, but in some cases, it's also a duty to modify your permit. So, and the last thing I'm going to say on, I guess, is levee conditions. If you are working within 1,500 feet of a federally regulated or state regulated levee, there are going to be a litany of conditions that are particular to that levee. There are going to be limitations on how deep you can excavate. There might be length limitations. If you're doing something like pulling up a pipe or putting in a pipe, you may only be able to excavate a certain number of footage of that trench at one time. And you may have to go backfill it and then excavate the next. So levee permits can get really detailed because they are engineering intensive and they are all designed to maintain the integrity of the levee that you're working next to. Sometimes you'll have seepage areas, in which case you'll have limitations on what the material of your piles can be. And so you don't run into them unless you're running next to a levee. But if you run next to a levee, your levee permit and your levee conditions can be pretty exhaustive. And that's what I want to say about that, Kareem. Thank you.
That's great. Going into, sort of continuation, mitigation requirements, that might include an avoidance or specific requirements or actions you need to take. So those may be spelled out in a permit. And then equipment size, type, and use limitation. Those could be spelled out and listed as a permit condition as well. So as you're thinking through the job and thinking through your equipment use, what you're going to deploy where, go back to your permit, look to see what you're allowed, what you're not allowed, and make sure that you stay within those conditions and those limits. So
right.
Some of the yep, go ahead.
Let me say in that one, particular that one, equipment size, type, and use limitations. Typical construction project, you may not run into those very often, but back to what I said a second ago, if you're working next to a levee, those things are very important. If you get on a levee with a piece of equipment that weighs more than 72,000 pounds, you're going to have big problems. If you use a track machine that is a size greater of the size that you told them you would have next to that levee, that's a problem. And so normal construction site, the equipment sizes and stuff like that, not that big a deal. You get close to a levee or get close to a waterway, and those things take on a new significance.
Great. So I think we've talked about some of the conditions and how to comply with them. I think let's talk about how to avoid them. And Brian alluded to this earlier. Read the permits, read your conditions and your figures as soon as they are received. I think this is the second time we mentioned it. We'll probably mention it one more time. Prep your site ahead of time for stormwater control according to your SWIP. Make sure that all your measures are installed before construction begins. Stake off the areas that are sensitive. Make sure that those are clearly marked for your construction crews to prevent any kind of encroachment. And then going back to that notification, some permits may require you to notify before work begins or after the project is completed. So a lot of these issues can be resolved just by reading the permit and making sure you understand the conditions before you begin work. Importance of pre-construction meetings, ongoing communication. I think I alluded to that earlier. Make sure that everyone within the team, as soon as that permit hits or you're starting work, make sure everyone is familiar with it. Any kind of ground changes, you will need to you may need to be captured in a permit update or modification. All the equipment operators, and I would say anyone involved in the project, needs to be familiar with the project provisions. Someone should be designated to monitor the SWIP. And if there are any questions, the agencies typically will answer questions or qualify or even clarify if needed, even after the project begins. And then very important, meeting among the site prep and construction personnel should highlight that permit conditions and the areas of note. So open communication as you begin to work, as you plan to work, needs to happen both within the project team and with agencies outside of the project team.
Right. And let me go back to that one. I want to say something on that one too, Kareem.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I think in my 35 years of doing permits, I think the most problems, and I'll qualify that by saying that over 20 of those years of my experience was working in a permitting capacity and environmental compliance capacity for St. Tammany Parish government. In my career, the primary cause of enforcement actions or permit violations on existing sites has to be, the most common thing you hear is the contractor saying, oh, well, I didn't see that, or nobody told me that, or I didn't understand that was a requirement. In parish terms, that's the Public Works Department, and the Public Works Department often does not get to see permits, and those kinds of activities can involve enforcement actions. And so, point being, everybody from prime contractor who's handling the coordination of the work, to the actual contractor who's putting it in, to the agents like us who are out there getting permits for a lot of these projects and stuff. It is probably one of the most important things you can do, and probably most people do this in my experience, is to have a pre post-project meeting with all of those parties, even the permitting agent, before everything starts, and just go over permit conditions, whatever they are, and make sure that the contractor is aware. It's pretty standard now, as long as timing works out, for the permits to be put in a lot of bid packages now. So contractors often get a chance to see that permit in the bid package, if they're lucky enough, and if permits have come out by that point. That's an opportunity for you to look at anything that's going to cause a problem with the job or whatever. And most contractors probably are accustomed to poring over bid packages for every piece of detail. But then once the job gets issued, and everybody goes out to work, it's almost as if everybody just said, well, we've already talked about the permit. And that's the time when the equipment is on its way, and that's the time to get together with everybody and make sure we all understand if anything has to be cordoned. I have worked on plenty of projects where there's a cultural resource mark somewhere in the project site. It's going to be a condition. If we're not going to relocate or do anything with that resource, we're going to have to cordon it off. And we're going to have to show that it's cordoned off, and it's going to be part of your permit. And if they go out there and that cultural site is not cordoned off, technically that's a violation. I mean, it's an easy one to remedy as long as you haven't destroyed it first. But, those are the kinds of things that happen best before everything starts.
Thanks, Brian. That was a good intro to our pre-construction planning and
Right.
understanding what needs to happen. And I think you covered a lot of this is, coordinating things off, some good fencing, signage, making sure everyone's aware where sensitive areas are, cultural resource areas, and then also that engagement. I always say continual early engagement with stakeholders and regulatory agencies. And I'm going to strike out when needed, because I think it's needed all the time. Just making sure that everyone is kept appraised of the work that's going on, and that continuous communication is happening. So thanks for
I have
that.
something to say on the engaging stakeholders.
Yep.
For contractors and engineers who are doing projects, and if you've been doing this a while, you probably know this, but your adjacent property owners to your project site are where 90% of your violation reports are coming from. So if you're out there, you contracted for a project and you're going out to do this project, if the Corps or DNR shows up and on a compliance check, it's usually because they got a call from somebody adjacent to the project site. So with regard to that stakeholders, it is more important than you may think to go meet those people, to go explain to them what you're doing, find out if there are any real concerns that maybe you can address for them, because when you're in construction, almost all of your enforcement delays and all of that come from the people next door. They are calling, they are looking at your project, they are hating that it is happening, and they are calling the Corps, they're calling the DNR to complain about you. So stakeholder engagement when you start a project is actually really important. If you can, and if it's possible or feasible, you go meet and talk to the people who are most likely to be the people complaining about your project. And that's just a strategy that I've always suggested, because sometimes those people who would call and complain won't do so if they just know what you're doing, or you've gone over and talked to them and explained to them what you're doing. Like, that can mitigate so many in-project delays, because your neighbor doesn't care about your delay, and he's just going to call the Corps and say, I think something's going wrong over there. Y'all need to go look. And that's how it happens. That's how 90% of it happens, is your adjacent landowners are going to be calling in the violations. And so, just as a rule, try to be easy with them, try to talk to them, try to mitigate whatever their concerns are, things like that. And that's just a strategy that I think works well. Just engage those guys.
Yep, that's great. I think we covered some of this, but monitoring and reporting, you also, as part of the permit condition, may be required to do some monitoring, understanding what those requirements are and how often that data must be collected and reported is important. Some of them may require impact monitoring, and in that case, the agency will dictate how things should be tracked before, during, and after construction. And then also, as you're building or constructing any habitat related projects, permits often require ongoing assessment for restoration and also endangered species mitigations. So again, making sure that as you begin this work, as you're engaging subs, if you're a contractor, making sure that everyone understands sort of those permit requirements, when monitoring needs to take place, and how it takes place, is something you can do to mitigate or to avoid any issues with compliance during construction. And then staff training. Train workers on permit conditions. Do those training sessions with employees for those environmental requirements. People come in and out of jobs. Make sure that you offer routine refresher training, periodic updates. You could do that during a safety tailgate. Just hit some of those permit conditions, make sure people know what's cordoned off, what's not, what's on limits, what's in the permit. And last I'll say is clear communication reduces risk, making sure again that staff are informed will minimize your chances of unintentional violation or project delays.
Right.
And I think
I have worked with more in my career. I have worked with more track machine operators than I'm probably entitled to. And I don't know how many times I have stood on the running board of a track machine with a permit, pointing to elements to the track machine driver on what he could and could not do, or what he was supposed to be accomplishing, only to find out that nobody ever really talked to the track machine driver. They just gave him a set of drawings and said, go do this. And so if even the track driver, even the skid steer guy, those are the people who need to understand the conditions of the permit, because those are the people turning the dirt. And the engineer can understand everything perfectly. The contractor can understand everything perfectly. They can give the map to an equipment operator who doesn't understand it perfectly, and in 45 minutes be in a violation that's now really hard to overcome. And so those guys with the big equipment are that's sort of where the pen meets the paper. They're the ones that are actually doing the work. And if they're not really understanding what they're doing, it does not take much at all to all of a sudden have a problem because somebody dug that ditch too long and now it's pulling in that low spot. Well, that was all your wetlands that you were supposed to be avoiding. But now because he dug 30 feet too far, now all of that is draining and now you've got a situation. And so, it's all the way from the engineer down to the equipment and the skid steer driver. Everybody needs to kind of understand what's going on with the permit, because they're the most removed from the administrative work, but they are the closest to the ground when you talk about equipment operators. And so they're as important as anybody else to understand that permit.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you, Kareem and Brian. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box right now, and we'll try to get you an answer. While I'm waiting to see if any questions come in, want to remind you that the presentation is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. In the next couple days, you'll receive a notification of that. Also, in the chat box, I have email addresses for both Kareem and Brian. Should you think of a question later or tomorrow, feel free to reach out to either of them. They'd be more than happy to speak with you and try to get your questions answered.
Absolutely.
Waiting, I'm not seeing any questions being entered into the chat box, which is a good sign. It usually means that the presentation was so informative that it answered every question that anyone could possibly have. I'll give it just a few more seconds here and see if anybody has any questions. Keep an eye out too. This is a monthly series that we do of webinars. If you follow us on LinkedIn, Elos Environmental, you can keep track of the different webinars that we have. And if there are any topics that you would like us to cover in a particular webinar, we'd be happy to hear from you. You can send a message through our website, and we'd love to hear your ideas if there are specific topics you'd like us to address. I'm not seeing that anyone is typing a question in the chat box. So with that, I will again thank you for coming today. Hope you found the session informative. We appreciate your attendance and we hope you found the presentation helpful. Thank you again to Brian and Kareem for presenting today. And with that, we will wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you all.